In the labyrinthine streets of old London, where gaslight struggled against encroaching shadows and fog crept like spectral fingers along cobblestones, there stood a shop. Its weathered facade, adorned with peeling paint and tarnished brass fittings, bore silent witness to the passage of countless years. A faded sign, barely legible in the dim light, proclaimed, "Grayson's Antiquities and Curios." Within this emporium of the arcane and forgotten, Alistair Grayson, a man as aged and enigmatic as the relics he peddled, lived a life of dusty solitude. His stooped figure, clad in a threadbare waistcoat and sporting a wild mane of silver hair, could often be seen shuffling between towering shelves laden with artifacts from every corner of the globe. Each item whispered secrets of distant lands and long-forgotten civilizations, but none could match the allure of his latest acquisition. It arrived on a night when the moon hung low and bloated in the sky, its sickly light barely penetrating the grimy windows of Grayson's shop. The crate, delivered by two surly men who seemed eager to be rid of their burden, bore no return address. Only a name was scrawled across its surface in spidery script: Fellworth. Alistair's gnarled hands trembled with anticipation as he pried open the wooden slats. The packing straw parted to reveal an ornate mirror, its surface as dark and still as a midnight pool. The frame, fashioned from some dense, unknown wood, was a masterpiece of intricate carving. Twisted faces peered out from every inch, their expressions caught in a rictus of agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. "Magnificent," Alistair breathed, his rheumy eyes wide with wonder. He ran his fingers along the frame, feeling the bumps and ridges of the carvings. As he did so, he could have sworn he felt a pulse of warmth, as if the wood itself were alive. For days, Alistair neglected his usual duties, spending hours studying the mirror. He pored over ancient tomes and crumbling manuscripts, searching for any mention of the Fellworth family or their mysterious mirror. What he found chilled him to the bone. The Fellworths, once a prominent family in the countryside of Devon, had a history steeped in whispered rumors of dark rituals and unexplained disappearances. Their ancestral home, Fellworth Manor, had stood for centuries before falling into ruin. The mirror, it was said, had been the centerpiece of their grand hall, a family heirloom of uncertain origin. As Alistair delved deeper into his research, he began to notice strange occurrences in his shop. Objects would move of their own accord, books would fall open to pages describing eldritch horrors, and the air grew thick with a miasma of decay. But it was the mirror itself that truly unsettled him. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting glimpse, a shadow where none should be, a face peering over his shoulder that vanished when he turned. But as the days wore on, the visions became more frequent, more substantial. One evening, as Alistair sat before the mirror, poring over a dusty volume of occult lore, he looked up to see a figure standing behind him. It was a woman, her face gaunt and eyes sunken, dressed in the finery of a bygone era. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear, and her arms reached out imploringly. Alistair whirled around, heart pounding, but found only empty air. When he turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone, but the surface of the glass seemed to ripple, as if disturbed by an unseen force. Alistair leaned closer, his breath fogging the dark surface. For a moment, he thought he saw faces swirling in the depths, their expressions twisted in anguish. "Impossible," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But even as he tried to dismiss what he'd seen, a part of him thrilled at the possibility. Could it be that the mirror was more than just a reflection of the physical world? Could it truly be a window to something beyond? From that moment on, Alistair's obsession grew. He neglected his business, turning away customers who dared to interrupt his vigil before the mirror. His few remaining friends, concerned by his disheveled appearance and wild-eyed rambling, began to avoid the shop altogether. But Alistair cared little for their concerns. He had glimpsed something extraordinary, something that defied the laws of nature and reason. With each passing day, the visions in the mirror became clearer, more frequent. He saw figures from different eras: Elizabethan nobles, Victorian gentlemen, even what appeared to be ancient druids, all trapped within the confines of the glass. And always, Lurking at the edges of these apparitions were the faces he now recognized as members of the Fellworth family. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and malevolence, seemed to follow him wherever he went in the shop. As his obsession deepened, Alistair's grip on reality began to slip. He found himself talking to the figures in the mirror, pleading with them to share their secrets. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the veil between worlds seemed thinnest, he thought he could hear them whispering back. It was during one of these nocturnal communion that Alistair first heard the name Ezekiel Fellworth. The whispers spoke of him as the patriarch of the family, the one who had first brought the mirror into their home. They hinted at dark rituals and forbidden knowledge, of a man driven mad by his quest for immortality. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Alistair redoubled his efforts to uncover the truth behind the mirror. He sent letters to fellow antiquarians and occult scholars, seeking any scrap of information about Ezekiel Fellworth or the mirror's origins. Most dismissed his inquiries as the ravings of a madman, but a few responded with tantalizing hints. One correspondent, a reclusive scholar living in the shadow of Dartmoor, sent Alistair a package containing a set of journals. They were the personal diaries of Ezekiel Fellworth, recovered from the ruins of the family manor. As Alistair pored over the faded pages, a chill ran down his spine. Ezekiel's writing spoke of ancient rites and eldritch beings that existed beyond the veil of human perception. He described experiments conducted in the dead of night, using the mirror as a focal point to pierce the barrier between worlds. But most disturbing were his descriptions of the price exacted for such forbidden knowledge. "The mirror hungers," Ezekiel had written in a particularly frenzied passage. "It demands sacrifice, a toll of flesh and spirit. With each passing day, I feel my very essence being drawn into its depths. And yet I cannot stop. The things I have seen, the knowledge I have gained, it is worth any cost." As Alistair read these words, he felt a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. He looked up at the mirror, its surface now seeming to pulse with an otherworldly energy. For the first time since it had come into his possession, he felt a flicker of fear. But that fear was quickly overwhelmed by a burning desire to know more. If Ezekiel Fellworth had indeed found a way to communicate with beings from beyond, then surely Alistair could do the same. He convinced himself that where Ezekiel had failed, he would succeed. He would unlock the mirror's secrets without falling prey to its hunger. With renewed determination, Alistair threw himself into his studies. He began to experiment with various rituals described in Ezekiel's journals, drawing arcane symbols on the floor of his shop and chanting in long-dead languages. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But then, on a night when a blood-red moon hung low in the sky, something changed. As Alistair stood before the mirror, reciting an incantation from one of Ezekiel's more obscure passages, the surface of the glass began to ripple and distort. The carved faces on the frame seemed to come alive, their mouths opening in silent screams. And from the depths of the mirror emerged a figure. It was Ezekiel Fellworth himself, his form translucent and shimmering like a heat haze. His eyes, sunken and filled with an otherworldly light, fixed upon Alistair with an intensity that made the old antiquarian stumble back. "You seek knowledge," Ezekiel's voice echoed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But are you prepared for the price it demands?" Alistair, his heart pounding so hard he feared it might burst from his chest, found himself nodding. "I am," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel's spectral form smiled, a rictus grin that held no warmth or mirth. "Then look deep into the mirror, Alistair Grayson. Look deep and see the truth that lies beyond the veil." Unable to resist, Alistair stepped closer to the mirror. As he gazed into its depths, the world around him seemed to fall away. He felt himself being drawn in, falling through layers of reality into a realm beyond human comprehension. What he saw there defied description. Vast alien landscapes stretched out before him, populated by beings of such cosmic horror that his mind reeled. He saw the birth and death of universes, the slow turning of great wheels of fate, and the creeping entropy that threatened to consume all of existence. And through it all he felt the mirror's hunger. It pulled at him, trying to draw his very essence into itself. Alistair tried to pull back, to wrench his gaze away from the horrors before him, but found himself unable to move. "This is the truth you sought," Ezekiel's voice whispered in his mind. "This is the knowledge for which we Fellworth sacrificed everything. Welcome, Alistair Grayson, to eternity." With a final, desperate effort, Alistair managed to tear his eyes away from the mirror. He fell backward, crashing into a display of ancient artifacts. As he lay there, gasping for breath, he saw his own reflection in the mirror's surface. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and filled with a terrible knowledge. And behind him, barely visible, stood the spectral forms of the Fellworth family, their arms outstretched as if to welcome him into their ranks. Alistair scrambled to his feet and fled from the shop, out into the foggy London night. But even as he ran, he knew it was too late. The mirror had shown him things that could not be unseen, revealed truths that could not be unlearned. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard the mirror calling to him, promising more secrets, more knowledge. Despite the terror that gripped him, Alistair knew that he would return. The mirror's pull was too strong, its lure too great to resist. As he disappeared into the mist-shrouded streets, the lights in his shop flickered and went out, leaving the mirror in darkness. But in its depths, something stirred, waiting patiently for its new acolyte to return and take his place among the forgotten souls. The fog-laden streets of London seemed to close in around Alistair Grayson as he stumbled through the night, his mind reeling from the eldritch visions that had assaulted him. The cobblestones beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if the very fabric of reality had been irrevocably altered by what he had witnessed in the depths of the Fellworth mirror. For 3 days and nights, Alistair wandered the city in a daze, sleeping in alleyways and subsisting on scraps. His once meticulously groomed appearance had given way to a wild-eyed, disheveled visage that caused passers-by to cross the street to avoid him. But even as he tried to put distance between himself and the shop, he felt the mirror's insidious pull, a constant tug at the edges of his consciousness. On the 4th night, as a gibbous moon cast its sickly light over the city, Alistair found himself standing before the door of his shop once more. His hand trembled as he reached for the key, every fiber of his being screaming at him to turn and run. But the siren call of forbidden knowledge was too strong to resist. The shop was exactly as he had left it, the mirror standing in silent accusation amidst the scattered debris of his flight. As Alistair approached, he could have sworn he saw movement in its depths, fleeting shadows that danced just beyond the edge of perception. I'm back," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Show me more." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the surface of the mirror began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen stone. Faces emerged from the darkness, their features twisted in a mixture of agony and ecstasy. Among them, Alistair recognized Ezekiel Fellworth, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "Welcome home, Seeker," Ezekiel's voice echoed in Alistair's mind. "Are you prepared to continue your journey into the unknown?" Alistair nodded, unable to form words as a mixture of terror and exhilaration coursed through him. He stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection distorting and blending with the spectral faces that crowded its surface. "Then let us begin," Ezekiel intoned. "But remember, knowledge exacts a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Before Alistair could respond, he felt himself being pulled forward, as if invisible hands had reached out from the mirror to grasp him. He tried to resist, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. As he watched in horror, his reflection began to change, aging decades in a matter of seconds. His hair whitened, his skin wrinkled and sagged, and his eyes sank deeper into their sockets. Just when Alistair thought he could bear no more, the pulling sensation ceased. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. When he finally managed to look up, he saw that the mirror had returned to its usual state, showing only his own haggard reflection. But something had changed. As Alistair struggled to his feet, he realized that his mind was filled with new knowledge, secrets of the universe that no mortal was meant to know. He understood now why the stars sometimes seemed to sing, and what lurked in the spaces between realities. The price for this knowledge had been years of his life, but in that moment, Alistair felt it was worth the cost. Over the next few weeks, Alistair fell into a routine of sorts. By day he would pore over ancient texts, cross-referencing the arcane knowledge gifted to him by the mirror with the writings of long-dead scholars. By night he would stand before the mirror, offering up more of his life force in exchange for deeper insights into the cosmic mysteries that now consumed him. His shop fell into even greater disrepair, dust gathering on forgotten artifacts as Alistair's obsession grew. The few customers who dared to enter were quickly shooed away, their mundane concerns seeming trivial in comparison to the grand truths Alistair now pursued. It was during one of these nocturnal sessions that Alistair first became aware of the whispering. At first, he dismissed it as the creaking of the old building or the scurrying of rats in the walls. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cacophony of voices speaking in languages both familiar and utterly alien. "The boundary weakens," they hissed. "The way opens. Prepare the vessel." Alistair found himself responding to the voices, engaging in lengthy conversations with entities he could not see but whose presence he could feel all around him. They spoke of cosmic cycles, of great old ones who slumbered in the void between worlds, and of a coming convergence that would reshape reality itself. As his sanity frayed at the edges, Alistair began to make preparations. He cleared a space in the center of his shop, pushing aside display cases and bookshelves to create a perfect circle. Within this space, he began to draw intricate patterns using a mixture of chalk, ash, and his own blood. The voices guided his hand, instructing him in the creation of sigils and glyphs that had not been seen on Earth in millennia. As he worked, Alistair felt a fever taking hold of him. His skin burned, and his vision blurred. But still he pressed on, driven by a compulsion he could neither understand nor resist. Days blended into nights as Alistair labored over his arcane diagram. He lost all track of time, sustained only by the knowledge being poured into his mind and the promise of what was to come. His body wasted away, but his spirit burned brighter than ever, fueled by eldritch energies that coursed through him. Finally, after what might have been weeks or months, the preparation was complete. Alistair stood at the edge of the circle, his once robust frame now little more than skin stretched over bone. The mirror loomed before him, its surface roiling with barely contained energies. "It is time," the voices whispered in unison. "The stars are aligned. The boundary is at its weakest. Open the way, Alistair Grayson, and claim your place among the cosmic elite." With trembling hands, Alistair reached out to touch the mirror's surface. As his fingers made contact with the glass, he felt a jolt of energy course through him. The carved faces on the frame came to life, their mouths opening in a silent scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The surface of the mirror shattered, but instead of falling to the ground, the shards hung suspended in the air, each one reflecting a different facet of the universe. Through these fragments, Alistair could see vast, alien landscapes, ancient cities built by non-Euclidean geometries, and beings of such cosmic scale that his mind threatened to break at the mere sight of them. From the shattered mirror emerged a procession of figures, each one more horrifying than the last. They were the trapped souls of the Fellworth family, but they had been changed by their long imprisonment. Their bodies were twisted and malformed, a blend of human and something utterly alien. At the head of this nightmarish parade stood Ezekiel Fellworth, or what remained of him. His form shifted and writhed, as if unable to settle on a single shape. When he spoke, his voice resonated with the power of 1,000 screaming souls. "The way is open," Ezekiel proclaimed. "The boundary between worlds has been breached. Now, Alistair Grayson, you shall take your place among us, and together we shall usher in a new age of cosmic enlightenment." Alistair felt himself being drawn towards the shattered mirror, his feet leaving the ground as an unseen force pulled him forward. He tried to resist, a last flicker of his human self rebelling against the fate that awaited him. But it was too late. The knowledge he had gained, the power he had tasted, it had all been leading to this moment. As he passed through the threshold between worlds, Alistair caught one last glimpse of his shop. The carefully drawn sigils were glowing with an unearthly light, and the air itself seemed to be tearing apart, revealing glimpses of the void beyond. He realized, in that final moment of clarity, that he had not just opened a door for the Fellworths to escape their prison. He had created a breach, through which something far worse could enter our world. The last thing Alistair Grayson saw before the human part of him was consumed entirely was a vast tentacled shape beginning to push its way through the rift he had created. Then darkness engulfed him, and he knew no more. In the days that followed, strange reports began to circulate through London. People spoke of odd lights seen in the sky, of unearthly sounds echoing through the streets, and of shadowy figures that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Those who lived near Grayson's Antiquities and Curios reported that the shop had fallen silent, its windows dark and its door firmly locked. But sometimes late at night, when the moon was hidden and the stars seemed to pulse with an ominous light, passers-by would swear they could hear whispers coming from within the shop. And if one were brave enough, or foolish enough, to peer through the grimy windows, they might catch a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Something that wore the face of Alistair Grayson, but whose eyes reflected the cold, uncaring vastness of the cosmos. And in the center of the shop, surrounded by the detritus of a life abandoned, stood the mirror. Its surface was whole once more, but those who gazed into it for too long found themselves plagued by nightmares of cosmic horror and existential dread. For the mirror was no longer just a reflection of our world. It had become a window to something beyond, a portal through which the unfathomable horrors of the universe could peer into our reality. The story of Alistair Grayson and the Fellworth mirror faded into urban legend, whispered about in occult circles and dismissed by rational minds. But the breach remained, a cancer in the fabric of reality, slowly widening with each passing day. And somewhere, in a realm beyond human comprehension, Alistair Grayson waited, his consciousness merged with those of the Fellworths and countless other souls, preparing for the day when the stars would align once more, and the way would be opened fully. For Alistair had learned the final terrible truth, that humanity's perception of reality was but a fragile illusion, a thin veil separating us from horrors beyond imagining. And he had become the key to tearing that veil aside, ushering in an age of cosmic enlightenment that would remake the world in the image of the eldritch beings that lurked just beyond the threshold of our reality. As the years passed and the world moved on, forgetting the strange tale of the antiquarian and his mirror, the shop remained a silent sentinel. But for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, it stood as a warning, a reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price, and that the universe holds secrets that were never meant for mortal minds to comprehend. And still the mirror waited, its surface as dark and still as the space between stars, ready to claim the next soul curious enough to peer into its depths and foolish enough to believe they could master the cosmic forces that lay beyond. The passage of time held little meaning in the realm beyond the shattered mirror. For Alistair Grayson, or the entity that had once been Alistair Grayson, existence had become a kaleidoscope of cosmic horrors and eldritch knowledge. His consciousness, now inextricably intertwined with those of the Fellworths and countless other trapped souls, drifted through vast, non-Euclidean spaces that defied mortal comprehension. In the world of men, years slipped by. The shop that had once been Grayson's Antiquities and Curios stood as a silent sentinel, its windows dark and its doors locked against curious intruders. The neighborhood around it changed, old buildings torn down to make way for new developments. But the shop remained untouched, protected by an aura of otherworldly menace that even the most hardened developers could sense, if not understand. Whispers of the shop's dark history circulated in occult circles. Urban explorers and thrill-seekers occasionally attempted to break in, drawn by rumors of the cursed mirror and the promise of supernatural encounters. Those who managed to gain entry were never seen again, their disappearances adding fuel to the growing legend of the haunted antique store. It was on a moonless night, when the stars seemed to pulse with an ominous alien rhythm, that everything changed. Deep within the shop, the mirror's surface began to ripple and distort. The carved faces on its frame writhed in silent agony as cracks spread across the glass like a web of dark veins. From these cracks a sound emerged, a low, thrumming vibration that resonated at a frequency just below human hearing. Dogs for blocks around began to howl, their animal senses picking up on the otherworldly disturbance. As the vibration grew in intensity, It began to affect the physical world. Objects throughout the shop began to rattle and shake, decades of accumulated dust rising in choking clouds. In the streets outside, people stopped in their tracks, overcome by a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads as visions of cosmic horror flashed behind their eyes. Others fled in blind panic, their minds unable to process the wrongness that permeated the air. Within the mirror, Alistair Grayson stirred. The part of him that still clung to his humanity recoiled at what he had become, at the monstrous amalgamation of souls and alien consciousness that now comprised his being. But that part was small, easily overpowered by the vast cosmic awareness he had gained. "The stars are right," the voices of the Fellworths whispered in unison, their words echoing through the fractured planes of reality. The boundary weakens. It is time. Alistair felt himself being pulled towards the surface of the mirror, drawn by an inexorable force that transcended physical laws. As he approached, he could see through the cracks in the glass, glimpsing the world he had left behind. It looked small, fragile, a thin bubble of reality floating in an infinite sea of cosmic horror. With a sound like the shattering of 1,000 mirrors, the glass exploded outward. Shards hung suspended in the air, each one a window to a different facet of the multiverse. Through these fragments, things began to emerge. Things that had no place in our reality, their very existence an affront to the laws of nature. Tentacles of impossible colors writhed through the air, followed by bulbous, pulsating masses that defied description. Eyes opened on surfaces where no eyes should be, drinking in the mundane reality of the shop with alien hunger. And through it all came Alistair, his form no longer even remotely human. A swirling vortex of darkness shot through with streaks of eldritch light. As Alistair's essence poured into the shop, the boundaries between dimensions began to blur. The walls seemed to breathe, surfaces rippling like water. Gravity fluctuated wildly, objects flying up to the ceiling before crashing back down. And still, more horrors emerged from the shattered mirror, an endless parade of cosmic abominations entering our world. Outside, the city was in chaos. The sky had taken on an unnatural hue, a sickly green that pulsed in time with the thrumming vibration emanating from the shop. Strange lights danced among the clouds, and those who looked up for too long found their minds unraveling, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. Emergency services were overwhelmed, their communication systems disrupted by bursts of static that sounded disturbingly like mad laughter. Those first responders, brave or foolish enough to approach the source of the disturbance, found themselves confronted by sights that defied explanation. Many fled in terror, their sanity stretched to breaking point. Those who stayed quickly wished they hadn't. As the night wore on, the breach widened. The shop itself began to warp and twist, its architecture rearranging itself into impossible configurations. Non-Euclidean angles replaced familiar right angles, and staircases led to places that shouldn't exist. The entire building had become a monument to madness, a physical manifestation of the cosmic horrors that now walked the earth. At the heart of this maelstrom stood Alistair, or what remained of him. His form shifted constantly, one moment a writhing mass of tentacles, the next a pillar of screaming faces, then a void of utter darkness ringed by eyes that blazed with eldritch fire. He was no longer merely a man, nor even a singular entity. He had become a conduit, a living portal through which the forces of the outer realms could enter our dimension. As dawn approached, a group of figures made their way through the chaos-stricken streets. They moved with purpose, seemingly unaffected by the madness around them. These were the last remaining members of an ancient order, keepers of forgotten lore who had prepared for this day since time immemorial. Led by a woman whose eyes held the weight of centuries, they formed a circle around the transformed shop. From beneath their robes, they produced artifacts of power, relics that hummed with barely contained energy, their surfaces etched with symbols that predated human civilization. "It ends here," the woman said, her voice carrying over the cacophony of eldritch sounds. "The breach must be sealed, no matter the cost." As one, the group began to chant, their voices rising in a counterpoint to the alien rhythms that filled the air. The artifacts in their hands began to glow, pulsing with a light that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. Inside the shop, Alistair felt the shift. The flow of cosmic energy faltered, the breach beginning to contract. For a moment, his human consciousness resurged, horrified by what he had become and what he had unleashed upon the world. "No," he tried to say, but his voice was lost among the 1,000 other voices that comprised his being. "What have I done?" The chanting grew louder, the light from the artifacts intensifying. The horrors that had emerged from the mirror began to be pulled back, screeching in alien tongues as they were forced to retreat. The walls of the shop groaned and buckled, the impossible geometries collapsing in on themselves. Alistair felt himself being torn apart, the cosmic forces that had transformed him now ripping him asunder. He saw the faces of the Fellworths, contorted in a mixture of rage and relief, as they too were pulled back towards the mirror. In that final moment, he understood the true price of the knowledge he had sought. Not just his life or his sanity, but the very fabric of reality itself. With a sound that could have been a scream or a sigh of relief, Alistair Grayson ceased to exist as an individual entity. His essence, along with those of the Fellworths and the cosmic horrors they had unleashed, was drawn back into the mirror. The shards of glass flew back together, sealing the breach with a finality that resonated across dimensions. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the chanting ceased. The woman who had led the group stepped forward, her face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. "It is done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The breach is sealed, but at great cost. The world will never be the same." Indeed, as the dust settled and the citizens of London emerged from their hiding places, it was clear that things had changed. Those who had witnessed the events of the night were irrevocably altered, their minds touched by glimpses of realities beyond human comprehension. The city itself bore scars of the incursion, patches where reality seemed thinner, where the laws of physics didn't quite work as they should, and at the center of it all stood the shop, now nothing more than a mundane building of brick and mortar. The eldritch energy that had transformed it was gone, leaving behind only a hollow shell. But in the back room, untouched by the devastation that had swept through the rest of the building, stood the mirror. Its surface was dark and still, reflecting nothing but empty shadow. Yet those who knew what to look for could see the truth, that the mirror was now a seal, a barrier holding back horrors that would unmake reality if ever released again. The woman approached the mirror, her reflection appearing old and weary in its surface. She placed a hand on the frame, feeling the latent power that still pulsed within. With those words, she turned away. The shop would be sealed, hidden from the world, its location obfuscated by powerful wards. The mirror would be watched, day and night, by those who understood the gravity of its existence. As the woman and her companions departed, leaving behind a city forever changed by cosmic forces, a final whisper echoed through the empty shop. It might have been the settling of old wood, or perhaps the last remnant of Alistair Grayson's consciousness, forever trapped between realities. The price of knowledge is high, but ignorance exacts a greater toll. Beware the mirrors of the soul, for they reflect truths we are not meant to see. And so the tale of the mirror of forgotten souls came to an end, its horrors contained but never truly vanquished. For in the cosmic dance of realities, nothing ever truly ends. It merely waits, patient and eternal, for the stars to align once more. In antique shops and curio stores around the world, mirrors stand silent sentinel, their surfaces reflecting the mundane world while hiding untold secrets. And sometimes, in the dead of night when the boundaries between worlds grow thin, those with the sight might catch a glimpse of other realms in their depths, a reminder that reality is far more vast and terrifying than we dare imagine. For Alistair Grayson and the Fellworths, eternity stretches on, their souls forever entwined in a cosmic tapestry beyond mortal comprehension. And the mirror waits, as it always has and always will, for the next seeker of forbidden knowledge to peer into its depths and unleash the horrors that lie beyond.